Canada's democracy experienced the ultimate event in a democracy, which in a democratic situation, which is a general election, as you all know. What I'd like to do is I'm just going to give some basic overview, a bit of the campaign, the results, a little bit of explanation, but I think what we want to do is maximize questions and answers, Q&A as we say. Hopefully Lucas will be with us. Lucas is of a different political persuasion. He's of the same persuasion as the Prime Minister. And we thought it was a good idea not just to have the Conservative view, but to also have the slightly more, I'll say, successful party, their point of view. He and I will have a difference about the degree of success. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. Well, as you all know, and those of you who attended the session on September 24th, and I'm certainly not going to repeat that, but I'm sure you all know this. Canada, of course, our electoral system is very constant with the British parliamentary Westminster system. The fancy word for it is single-member plurality. That simply means that there's 338 separate geographical units spread across the country based on population and so on, and other regional considerations. And a single person is elected as the member of parliament for that constituency, and all you have to do is make sure you get one more vote than anybody else. So it's like a plurality system, it's not a majority system. And so it does create some, and which this election showed, you can have some people call it inequity, some people just think it's the nature of the system, where it is possible for a political party, for instance, which is what happened in this election, to actually get more popular votes, to have more individual Canadians vote for their candidates than another party, but because of efficiency of vote, and I'll talk about that concept, and other regional differences, the other party actually gets more seats in the House of Commons. And of course, that's the ultimate test in the British parliamentary system, who gets the most seats. Preferably, of course, but that's the norm in Canada, is the ideal is a majority. And there was a single party, gets, in our case, 178 of their candidates elected, so they have an absolute majority on the floor of the House of Commons. That's usually what happens in Canada, but in this election, we, of course, that did not happen. No single party, as you know, got a majority. I think you've all read the newspapers. I don't have to go over the numbers again, except just to say a couple interesting things that you may have noted or not. Comparing this election, 2019, to the last federal general election, 2015, when Mr. Harper's government was defeated by Mr. Trudeau's party, who got a majority, my estimate is that in the Liberal Party, every single province, and all but one province, anyway, every single province, the Liberals got less votes than they got last time, as a percentage. They also got less seats in every province except Prince Edward Island. They had all four last time, and they got all four again. For the Conservatives, a little bit different. Their popular vote went up in every single province except two critical ones, and their seats went up in every single province. The two provinces where the popular vote dropped a little bit was Quebec, just less than 0.5%. But the Conservatives also lost 2 seats. It went from 12 to 10 there. And of course, the critical province where we're at, the kingpin of Confederation, the Ontario, the largest province in population, not in size, but in population, the Conservatives picked up 3 seats. Net gain went from 33 to 36. But their popular vote actually went down, which did surprise us on the Conservative side. In the last election, even though it was a very unpopular government, Mr. Harper and the Conservatives got 35% of the popular vote in Ontario last time, and 33 seats. The Conservatives actually got only 33% of the popular vote this time. I'm going to explain why I think that came about, but a slightly few more seats. Again, that's the vagaries of the system. But one of the features about this election is that, as I mentioned to you, the Liberal Party actually got slightly less votes than the Conservatives. And in fact, they got about 33.5%. And I was looking back at all minority parliaments going back to the 20s when they first started, and this is by far the lowest percentage of a popular vote an incumbent government has ever received. So in a sense, if we're thinking of politics as a mandate of the people, Mr. Trudeau should keep this in mind. I'm speaking a little bit more as a Conservative on this, but he should keep in mind he's got a limited mandate. He's got a mandate, got the most seats, title to govern, whatever arrangements he can make, and we'll talk about that in Parliament. But the fact is, it is a very limited mandate. He's lost considerable numbers of seats, but he actually got less votes than the Conservative Party. And he got the lowest percentage of any government in Canadian, incumbent government in Canadian political political history. The other thing I wanted to mention too, because of the vagaries of this what we call first past the post system that I described, what often happens, and the same thing happens in British and Australian politics, you get what are sometimes called the marginal seats. These are often the target seats that a lot of the parties are actually concentrating on, or sometimes called the swing ridings. And my definition of swing, when the results come out, is the difference between the top candidate and the next candidate 5% or less of the vote. Then I think you're into a tight race. And by my calculation, the result of the vote on Monday, there are 31 such constituencies. And the Conservatives won a few of them, but most of them were won by the Liberals. That's the first thing I wanted to mention. Second thing is, and I want to keep this fairly sweet, one of the things that was excessive amount of polling in the election, just a massive, there seem to be about 3 polls a day if you're following the course. And plus this new process of where they take the poll of polls. There's a few of those, but they take all the votes of all the polls and combine them all together and average them up and somehow come up and predict every riding in the country and which party's going to win it. For most of the election, the popular vote in terms of the pollsters was the Liberals and Conservatives were tied most of the time. Sometimes the Liberals a little bit ahead, sometimes the Conservatives a little bit ahead. The one consistent thing was in every poll I saw, except I think one, the projection of the seats is the Liberals would win the most seats. No one was getting a majority, and the polls were right about that. In fact, a lot of people knock the pollsters. They say politicians are usually the ones that knock the pollsters, but in fact, they're reasonably accurate. They underestimated the Conservative popular vote, and they underestimated the Liberal seat vote. The Liberals did a little better than almost by about 10 or 15 seats than what sort of the outlier projections were. But the important thing about polls, of course, and Lucas, when he's introduced, can talk to you about that, is that a poll is only a snapshot of opinion at the time it's taken, right? As Harold Wilson, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, said, a week in politics can be a long time. I would suggest an election campaign, 24 hours can be a long time. So all you can know as a poll is that's how people are thinking right now. You cannot be sure on polling day what actually is going to happen. But as I say, I think they were reasonably accurate this time than sometimes in past elections. But anyway, as a result of first past the post and some of the vagaries of that, we're ending up with a minority parliament. But again, the largest party with seats has less percentage of the popular vote. I'm going to skip over a couple of things because we wanted to keep this a little shorter. The other thing I wanted to mention about the popular vote itself, and I'll get onto the campaign, which concerns me particularly as a Conservative, is the regional disparity. There's always been, for most of my lifetime, Western Canada generally votes Conservative, usually by pluralities, and the NDP usually said, but sometimes there are elections where the Liberals do quite well. But in this election, if you go and look at the popular vote in the provinces, it is a really great concern. For instance, remember, we're talking about the governing party of the country. We're talking about legitimacy. The Liberal Party only got 11.1% of the vote in the province of Saskatchewan. 11.1. That means 89% of the people in Saskatchewan who took the time to vote voted against the government. Alberta was about 16%. So those kind of disparities are a little bit concerning. And of course, it reflected in the seats, where, of course, the Conservative Party took all but 1 seat in Alberta, all of the seats in Saskatchewan, and half the seats in Manitoba. So there's that disparity as well. There's a little more of a breakdown in British Columbia. A little bit about, I guess, the campaign itself. I mentioned this morning's session. If you were to look at the campaign, the public campaign, what we were seeing in whether it's the leaders' debates and candidates and so on, I got to tell you that I found it the most disappointing election as a citizen I've ever experienced in about 50 years of this game.
Not just because your party lost.
No, not. I think at all levels. Thank you, Lucas. Losing didn't help. But and I just think the level of discourse, the quality of the leaders, all parties I'm talking about, except one leader I'm going to talk about in a minute, I think who's actually close to being outstanding. Well, that's the Bloc leader, and we'll talk about that and why I think that. and I think a term I'm beginning to use to describe this election, as far as the public campaign, is what I call the Seinfeld election. If you all know what I mean, there used to be a TV show, and it was a TV show about nothing. So I really found that in terms of the discourse, the dialogue, the leaders were talking about nothing. Nothing of great significance. For instance, it came up in the morning sessions, and all be of great interest to you. Probably the greatest geopolitical challenge facing us for the next bit of this century, regardless of pro and con it, is the rise of China. China was not mentioned, even though Canada's having some particular difficulties with the Chinese government, some areas of policy. I saw no reference to it in any literature. I saw no reference to any of the party leaders or any candidate, and maybe some individual candidates talked about it, about China. Now, maybe I think it's probably because the politicians felt that they couldn't win or lose on that issue, so why talk about it? Maybe they didn't have much to offer. But it is kind of astounding when you think about it. They talked an awful lot about a lot of things. I won't get into all of them. They're a lot less significant than that. But mind you, the tradition in Canadian federal elections is foreign policy, you need to know, is not usually dominant. It's usually domestic policy in any case. But I've just seen it worse this time. It seemed to be almost more absent in the discourse, in the debate, than I've ever seen before. The other thing I wanted to mention too was that one of the issues that came up was turnout. What I mean by that, the percentage of the voters. Statistic I've seen, I think the overall turnout was about 66.5%, which is down a little bit from 69. But remember, that's a percentage of those registered to vote. That's not the eligible. There's hundreds of thousands of Canadians, maybe more than 1 million, who are eligible and have not been registered. And of course, there's also the anomaly under our Canada Elections Act. Even if you're not registered, you can go into a polling station on polling day, and with adequate ID, you can get to vote. So when you see Elections Canada saying it's 66, it's 66% of the registered before polling day. And it doesn't measure all the people who aren't registered and don't show up at all. So it's probably actually lower. As a percentage of the voting population, it's probably 3 or 4 points less than that, simply because there's swaths of the population never get registered and never do show up to vote at all. But turnout also is interesting in terms of various parts of the country, because the turnout rate was different, and you'd be interested to know that of the top 5 ridings with the highest turnout, 2 of them were in Ottawa. One was actually the riding of Carleton, with a 77.5% turnout, and Ottawa Centre, which is where we are right now, was very high as well. And that's been explained by the fact this is, of course, the capital. There's a lot of public servants. There's a lot more people who are paying attention to politics, generally. So you would expect a higher turnout. And so we got a high turnout there. For some reason, the rural riding called Souris Moose Mountain had a high turnout. Don't know what that's all about. And then the lowest turnout, some is under 50%. A lot of them were where there's large Indian reserves, particularly north in Quebec and in northern Saskatchewan. And I think it's caused by 2 things. Weather, seriously. Weather can be bad, long distances to drive the polling station, but also a lot of our Aboriginal people have decided that their nation, and I say this with due respect to them, their ultimate nation is not Canada, it is their nation, the Aboriginal nation. Canada is not necessarily their political nation. It's an entity that has some governance over them, and so there's often low turnout, not always, but often on Indian reserves. They just don't identify with the political process, so that may explain why that happened. The thing I want to mention about it, we talk a lot about media, always talk about winners and losers, and Lucas and I have little subtle differences on that. My view is, although I think he and I agree on one thing, all of the parties except the Bloc, I'll get back to the Bloc, they all were both winners and losers. In other words, if I was to take each of the parties, yes, I'll give them a positive ribbon, and then I give them a kick on the backside. For my party, the Conservative Party, as a winner, well, we picked up 23, we're the only party to pick up so many seats, 23 seats. Popular vote went up every province. We did reduce the mighty Liberal Party to a minority. That's sort of on the plus side. But on the negative side is, and not to put too fine a point on it, we're in a situation in Canada where we have a Prime Minister, and I say this with all due respect to him and particularly his office, but we have a Prime Minister who has twice been found in violation of ethic violations. The Ethics Commissioner and the RCMP have both said that on the SNC matter, The Prime Minister is refusing to allow release of confidential cabinet documents so they can't interview certain witnesses. There's that to start with. Secondly, you have a government that had two big promises in the last election. One was electoral reform. We'll get back to that. Prime Minister is quoted as saying, Trudeau said, this is the last election in which we're going to have first past the post. And the other was deficits. If you remember the 2015 election, Mr. Trudeau said, quite successfully politically, well, we'll have some temporary deficits, particularly on infrastructure, but we're not going to go much over 10 billion a year. And certainly by the end of my first term, we'll be back to a balanced budget. Well, I don't have to say anything to you. The budget's just going through the roof. If you add all those things together, along with the unfortunate blackface situation, which is kind of silly, and other embarrassing things, and the SNC, this was the election for the Conservatives to win. This was the election for them to win, and they didn't. And so that's where I kicked them in the butt. That's where they lost. They ultimately were not able to get the most seats and form the government. And it's all about getting office. So the ultimate victory was not achieved. And the Liberals had a limited victory, not a complete victory, because they didn't get a majority. For the NDP, I guess the good news is it's all about expectations. In the last election, the NDP got 44 seats under Mr. Mulcair. Going into this election, Mr. Singh was not regarded as a strong leader. There was even talk at the beginning of the campaign that the New Democrats may be reduced under 12 seats, which means they couldn't even be official party in the House of Commons. He was able to run, he was very good in the debates, ran a good campaign, and so the expectations, but then the expectations got higher. Everyone thought he might get 35, 40 seats. He ends up with 25. So he's a little bit of a victory there. But if you take the province of Quebec, here's the real defeat. 2 elections ago, Jack Layton led the NDP to take 59 seats in Quebec, the largest number of seats. Under Mr. Mulcair, dropped to 16, and on Monday night they got 1. Complete collapse of the NDP, which was anticipated, but nonetheless, that's actually what happened. That's what the polls said. So that's certainly a minus. The other plus for them, though, is that they are in a much more strategic position in this parliament. We'll talk more about that. They can control. They're one of the controlling parties because their votes added to the Liberals gives the Liberals a majority. So Mr. Singh will be arguably in a bargaining position to bargain for policy changes from the government. So he's in a strategic, powerful position in terms of bargaining in this parliament because he can control potentially how Parliament's going to proceed on certain issues. As I say, the big winner was the Bloc. The Bloc came into this election, low expectations. I think I saw some early polls said somebody thought they'd make it 12, 13 seats at the most. Hardly cut into the Liberal vote. It turns out they took what? I think it's 32, Lucas? 32 or 34? 32. They took, and all those seats, see, but one of the, and Lucas as a Liberal can speak more about this, going into this election, just to remind you, the last federal election, the Liberals took 184 seats. 170 is an absolute majority. So for them to prevent themselves from going into minority, they couldn't have a net loss of more than 14. They knew they were going to have losses, everybody knew this, in rural parts of Ontario that unnaturally, in my view, voted Liberal last time. They knew they were going to lose seats, probably all their seats in Alberta, and some in British Columbia, and maybe, as it turned out, Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So they felt that if they could pick up those 15 vulnerable NDP seats, they could counteract those losses. Well, I took a look, and I think of the 16 seats, one went NDP, and the other 15 or 14 of the 15 all went Bloc. The Bloc simply took over from the Liberals and that stole that NDP vote from them, and of course then therefore denied not only a majority to Mr. Trudeau, but not even a majority of the seats in Quebec. In fact, they had net loss of about 5 seats in his home province. They came from nowhere. Their leader was impressive in the debates, if you watched him. I'd never heard of the guy before, quite frankly. He's just a very good political actor, performer, and he did very well. And of course, it's a little easier job because he's the one guy not running for prime minister, right? He doesn't have to announce on national policies. And he's in a very strategic position as well, depending on the issue. And I want to get into that, and then I want to pass things over to Lucas. I'll jump right ahead and talk about some of the consequences of this election, which is now a minority parliament in terms of what goes on in Parliament and in Cabinet. In Parliament itself, as probably some of you know, if the government doesn't have a majority in the chamber, then it doesn't have a majority in any of the standing committees. So the opposition parties can control what those committees will study, how they will handle legislation when it's referred to them. They outvote the government. And I noticed there was some reference in the press today, everybody's chafing a bit, oh, the SNC Lavalin matter. The Conservatives are saying, yes, we'll get into that committee, and between us and the New Democrats, we'll get that on. Well, what about the Bloc? And the reality is the Bloc do not want an investigation on SNC Lavalin. They simply wanted to get the remediation agreement because it's jobs in Quebec. So I predict the Bloc will vote with the Liberals to deny an inquiry, at least a parliamentary inquiry. Now, there may be further investigations from the RCMP or whatever, but we know nothing about that at this point. On the other hand, take the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Mr. Singh and Ms. May say, absolutely, we're totally opposed to this. We could never support this under any circumstances. Remember what the Bloc said? The Bloc said, well, we will vote for anything in terms of Quebec's interest, which is both positive. In other words, if it's in our favor, we'll vote for it. Or as long as it doesn't hurt us. Well, what they can do, if there is even a vote on that issue, I don't think there will necessarily parliamentary have to be so procedural, the Bloc can say, we don't care, it's not crossing Quebec. So in the end, and this is where Mr. Trudeau is going to be potentially in this advantageous position that he can play the minor parties off against each other depending on the issue. Now, it depends whether they're ready to play ball with him and to what extent he's able and skilled enough to play that. One of the problems I would just comment, again, Lucas can comment on, he has lost some of his front bench. I'm particularly thinking of Ralph Goodale in terms of experience. So whether he has the bench strength and the parliamentary strength, because there's going to be a lot of maneuvers, whether he'll be able to steer that course through those parties, but he certainly has that opportunity. And it'll just depend on the personalities and how Parliament proceeds on that. I think, I'm going to... one thing I just want to say about Cabinet that is of concern to me. There's been a tradition in Canadian politics that if the governing party doesn't get any seats in a province, in the old days, the pre-Justin Trudeau days, the Prime Minister would appoint a senator to sit in Cabinet so that province at least has a voice, at the Cabinet table. Either an existing senator or sometimes somebody else put them in the Senate. But of course, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, I had experience working in the Senate for the last year, but there's a wholly new different Senate that's been created, which is supposedly independent, this independent senators group. And yesterday, Senator Wu, who's the leader of this nonpartisan group, had the nerve, in my opinion, to come out, because there was some suggestion Mr. Trudeau might appoint, for instance, Mr. Goodale to be in the Senate to represent Saskatchewan, or somebody else. And he had the nerve to come out and say, which I think is a traditional prerogative of the Prime Minister, no, you can't do that. You told us this is, he was pointing, Mr. This is nonpartisan. You can't put partisans in here. So it'll be interesting to see how the Prime Minister, I think, quite frankly, Canadians would be quite tolerant of that. I think a lot of Canadians will say, I think it's a good idea. Alberta needs a voice at the Cabinet table. And I think if Mr. Trudeau's smart, he'll ignore Mr. Wu, Senator Wu, and just go ahead and make those appointments, because I think it's important those voices be at that. And I think most Canadians would just go along with that. Mm-hmm. And it won't be seen as an interference with this notion of independent Senate, myself. But Mr. Wu was fast on the mark yesterday, and he was asserting the so-called independence of that body. So we'll see what happens with that. So there are real consequences for the House of Commons and how legislation moves through committee and through the House, and what matters will be inquired, studied, and which won't, based on the preferences of the parties and how they vote in committee. So fasten your seatbelts, folks. This is going to be an interesting political ride for a while.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Donison. As you can tell, there's extensive knowledge, and so you'll have an opportunity to hear more through your questions. But at this point in time, I want to invite a colleague of Mr. Donison. They work together for the same group for some time, but Lucas Malinowski is a public affairs professional, is currently government relations manager of Canadian Fuels Association. He's got extensive experience in those areas, as well as prior to that, 2014 to 2018, was with the provincial government here in Ontario in a number of different roles. So he's going to give some perspective as well, and then following that, it's up to you to ask your questions. But please.
Thanks, Darlene. And thank you, Mike.
for your completely incorrect analysis of the election. But
I haven't
appreciate
finished, I
that.
got more to say.
So, as Mike has said, his partisan background is conservative and mine is liberal. I just want to make very clear, I had no official capacity or role in this previous election, but a lot of people I have worked with on elections prior have worked on this election, and I'm here to provide some of my personal insights. I don't speak for the Liberal Party, I don't speak for the current government, I don't speak for the Canadian Fuels Association, which I'm currently employed by, but I am a Liberal and I have worked with a lot of these folks who ran this election, so hopefully you find some of my thoughts interesting. I'll speak briefly about the election, and I think Mike's done a pretty good job of that overview, and I don't want to spend the majority of my time giving you some ideas of what to expect next in the coming months, which I hope you'll find useful. I agree with Mike that this was a bit of a nothing election. Both major parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, went into it essentially tied, and nothing during this campaign managed to move the needle of public opinion, whether it be a policy idea, a positive thing that a party put forward in its platform didn't seem to motivate voters, or whether a negative scandal that occurred to a party, if it did sway voters, it was for a short period of time. I think the voting public was largely disillusioned and disenchanted with this election, which is a real contrast from the last federal election in Canada in 2015, where there was a clear question put before voters of whether they wanted to continue the Harper Conservative government or whether they wanted change. And the Trudeau Liberals did a very good job of positioning themselves as that contrast to the existing government and being that change. There was speculation that this election was going to be about climate change. It wasn't about climate change. There was speculation that it was going to be about affordability, and while there's still a lot of anxiety for average Canadians in terms of affordability and whether or not they'll be able to afford a home or continue to be able to afford their mortgage, I don't think any party did a really good job of providing some sort of policy of positioning themselves as really the champion of affordability. The Conservatives talked about it a lot.
They did.
I think all parties recognize that there's that anxiety out there, but nobody really had a good answer that people were convinced of. It wasn't about foreign policy or international relations at all. As you mentioned, China was not mentioned at all by either major parties. So really, I think this came down to, the election came down to two things. It was a question of personality for the leaders, which it often is to an extent. But really, it was about the respective parties' ability to organize and get votes out during the election. So in Canada now, the major parties have a very formalized, data-driven way of running campaigns. So the way an election is generally run in Canada, and the Conservatives really pioneered this under the Harper leadership, and the Liberals have largely caught up now. Some would argue, surpass the Conservatives in their data-driven metrics. But essentially what every campaign is doing is at every local riding level, they're knocking on doors, they're engaging with people, and they're trying to identify who our supporters are. So when you are running a local campaign, oftentimes your candidate is out there to convince people to vote for them, but your volunteers aren't generally doing a job of selling the party or selling the candidate. They're out there figuring out, is this person going to vote Liberal? Are they going to vote Conservative? And keeping track of those people and then making sure that those people do go out and vote. Your people go out and vote. I don't want his people to go out and vote.
Vice versa.
And vice versa, right? Traditionally in Canada, the Conservatives have a very strong motivated base of voters of around 26 to 30% that can be reliably counted on to vote Conservative and to come out and vote. So they have a very strong base. The Liberals typically have a much more flexible base of voters that they're fishing from. It's about a 40% block of people, and then the other 30% are hopeless. They may decide to vote, they may decide not to vote. It depends on election to election. But really, that's that 40% that the Liberal Party is typically fishing in. So they will, from election to election, change their policies, change their positions, trying to follow where they think the electorate is going, where the popular sentiment is going. It's a centrist party. It's a bit more of a pragmatic party. And I think the challenge for the Conservatives in this election was Conservatives typically win when they can grow that base, where they hold on to that 30%, but also move into the middle a little bit and pick up some extra votes. I don't think they did a good job of that this election. I think that's really what cost them, certainly in Ontario. They did a good job of solidifying that base in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, where you saw candidates winning with 70, 75, 80% of the vote. But in our first past the post system, winning by 20,000 votes is as good as winning by 1 vote. So it doesn't really reward that kind of high score on a local campaign. Whereas the Liberals did very well in Ontario, where they needed to do well. They did not do as well as they had hoped in Quebec. And I think that'll be interesting for this government, because already from Tuesday on, all parties were thinking, what is their strategy for the next election? And for the Liberals, I think it's quite clear that for this election, their path to majority was through Quebec, and because of the rise of the Bloc Québécois, that didn't happen. So there'll be a lot of consideration given to how to change that for the next time around. What are the issues that are really driving voters in Quebec, and how do they peel away that Bloc vote and maybe some Conservative votes, but really that soft nationalist, progressive vote that was taken away by the Bloc this time around. So implications now, I think, going forward, Mike did a good job of talking about a minority government and what it means from a parliamentary perspective. I will say it's a pretty strong minority government. The gap between the Conservative Party, which are in second place, and the governing Liberals is too wide for the Conservatives plus the NDP, or the Conservatives plus the Bloc, to defeat the Liberals. And this is important because it means that in order to pass legislation, the Liberal government doesn't necessarily need one of the other parties to vote for the legislation. They can just abstain. So if the Bloc and the Conservatives combine to vote against a piece of legislation or a budget bill or whatever the case may be, but the NDP decide not to vote, they abstain, the Liberals have enough votes to push that through. Scheduling votes will be much more difficult in a minority government because you don't have the timetable powers that you do in a majority government. So while they can pass legislation, they can't do it as quickly. So I think you'll see the government trying to do more through regulation and other levers of power that don't require them to pass bills through the House. You'll see a bit of that shift. For your mission specifically, the challenge will be that votes are incredibly important now in Parliament. So the Prime Minister's office and the Government House Leader's office and the Whip's office will be very reticent to, one, allow travel for ministers and MPs outside of Ottawa, or for foreign trips for extended periods of time while the House is sitting, because they need every single vote and they need it in the House. And it will also be difficult to get the same kind of participation in events and receptions. Because if there's a potential of a vote happening in Parliament, the government doesn't want to have 20 MPs at a reception 5 kilometers from Parliament. So geography is very important. If you're putting on any events, try and make them as close to Parliament as possible if you want to have MPs attending. Because they may be under strict orders that they, if the bells start ringing, they have 30 minutes to get into the chamber to vote. And if you're more than 30 minutes away, Mike knows about this, the government might fall.
That's right.
Yeah, you had some experience
I
with
worked for a government that fell because of those bells.
because of those bells, right? And members being too far. So they'll be very strict and very tight on that. So that's just a practical consideration to keep in mind. Another thing, in terms of mechanics of what's going to be happening next with the government, the Prime Minister's already signaled that the new cabinet will be announced November 20th. It'll again be a gender-balanced cabinet, 50% men, 50% women. The fact that the government's taking a bit of time to announce and build the new cabinet, I think shows that they're taking some time to take stock of the implications of the election, what to do about the regional challenges in the prairies, but not just in terms of what their cabinet is going to look like. What is the senior team around the Prime Minister going to look like? because the team that worked for this government in the last election might not be the right team for a minority government situation. It requires a different skill set. It requires different experiences. So in the coming weeks, the transition team will be building the core team of senior staff around the Prime Minister, including the Principal Secretary and the Chief of Staff. And that team will really be the decision-making table for building the cabinet that we'll see on November 20th. And I don't envy the challenge that team has with this cabinet. In the last election, they only lost 2 sitting ministers, Minister Soki in Edmonton, who was the Minister of Natural Resources, and Minister Goodale in Regina, who was the Minister of Public Safety. So you didn't have a lot of spots opened up, so all the existing ministers presumably would like to expect to be in cabinet again. But you have a good team of backbench MPs who weren't in cabinet under the last government, but did perform well in various files, were in contentious and tightly fought elections and managed to win their local elections and be elected back to the House of Commons, and they'll have some expectation of being allowed into cabinet finally after being patient over the last 4 years. And then there are also some star candidates that were elected under the Liberal banner in this election and will be new coming to the House, but there may be some expectation that they be given some prominent roles as well. So without trying to build the cabinet much bigger, which is also, that has challenges for Parliament itself. Ministers typically don't have as much time and ability to spend time in the House, and the ministerial duties constrain themselves. You don't want too large of a cabinet because you want as many votes in the House as consistently and as predictably as possible. Once the cabinet is sworn in, then each minister's office will be staffed with a chief of staff who will then have the responsibility of staffing their respective minister's office. In terms of Parliament returning, there's some speculation we may have a speech from the throne in December, which would be the Prime Minister's first opportunity to test the confidence of the House, to see if the voting math makes sense that they can continue to govern. I expect that whenever that speech from the throne happens, that they will probably it will probably pass, not necessarily with support from the other parties, but because the NDP are in no shape to run an election and they may abstain, and then allow it to pass that way. But most likely the real session of Parliament is likely to come back in January, I think. There is one caveat for that. If there's any developments on the new North American Free Trade Agreement with the United States, if for some reason things move in the US and there is a need to bring Parliament back to ratify that trade agreement, Parliament will be brought back rather quickly. And that brings me to the point of foreign affairs under this government, both in the last 4 years and I think going forward. The new NAFTA trade agreement really consumed a lot of the resources and the energy of this government on the foreign affairs side of things, despite challenges with relations with China, with Saudi Arabia, some challenges with the relationship with India now too. A lot of the Prime Minister's key and most experienced and most trusted staff were really consumed with negotiations with the United States on the free trade agreement. So there wasn't a lot of energy to engage much more deeply on other issues of international relations. But I also think the fact that the new NAFTA was largely dealt with as an issue ahead of this election, foreign affairs and international relations were essentially a non-issue in an election that really was about nothing. Foreign affairs was really not discussed. I think if the NAFTA negotiations were still up in the air, that would be a different situation. But with that being put away, it really was an issue. One point I do want to make, Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada, which was an offshoot from the Conservative Party. Mr. Bernier came in a close second in the previous leadership contest, which Mr. Scheer won to be the leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. Decided to leave the Conservative Party and start his own party, which is even more to the right of the Conservative Party, and a lot of their policy positions, I think, can be described as more insular. Certainly very critical of the government on immigration, very critical of the government on refugee policy. And there was some concern that the People's Party would have actually a fairly respectable showing in this election. That was not the case. They won about 1.5% of the popular vote, and Mr. Bernier failed to keep his own seat in Parliament. So they were completely wiped out. So I will just say, I think that is a reflection that Canadians largely are, while there may be some anxieties, around affordability and the global economy and things like that, I think Canadians largely have rejected a more insular approach to policy. They're not interested in closing borders or really restricting trade. I think that question was put to them and it was largely rejected, which from my perspective is a positive thing, and I think Mike, you might agree as well. There isn't that kind of constituency for that in Canada as we are seeing in some other Western democracies, changing over the last 5-10 years. So this government certainly has some challenges ahead of it. I think the pieces are there for it to stably govern for at least the next 2 years, and the next election will probably be at a timing of the Prime Minister's choosing, barring any scandals.
Those can always happen.
Those can always happen, events, as we call them. But I think we can expect it to govern comfortably for the next 2 years, and we probably won't have another election until the Liberals feel that they are in a decent position to get back to a majority government.
Is that one of the great strengths of the Conservative Party, and the Liberals will admit this, is not only in identifying vote, but in fundraising. We're way ahead of the other parties. We have a motivated donor base. We've done an analysis, which I can disclose, nothing particularly secret. As you probably know, under the Canada Elections Act, if you run 338 candidates and you have a full slate, which the NDP, Liberals, and Conservatives did, you're entitled to spend up to $28 million. That's the national. The local candidates have their limits as well. And if you file your returns with Elections Canada, and they pass their accounting standards and so on, 50% of whatever you spent is a rebate. The taxpayers give the political party, in this case, $14 million. So we've done an estimation that after all the rebates come through, the Liberals have spent $28 million, they'll get their 14, we will. I don't think the NDP quite spent $28 million, they were about $25 million. They'll get. After all the rebates, this is what the financial position of the three parties will be. The Conservative Party will not only have no debt, it will have $10 million in the bank. The Liberal Party will have no debt, zero in the bank. I mean, in other words, it'll be current, okay, right? And the NDP, God bless them, not only will they be $10 million in current debt, they will have the 2 mortgages in the Jack Layton building, which we don't know the amount of those, probably maybe $1 million, $2 million. They will be in no position to run a campaign. They're going to need the 2 or 3 years to, and I'm sure they'll work off that to get back into even a reasonable financial position where a bank will even lend them money. This is a serious, because they've already banked the building. The major big assets been mortgaged, I'm told, to almost the hilt, almost all its equity. So, how would they raise the money if suddenly there was an election in 6 months or 3 months? So I think that's something to keep in mind. The Conservatives are the most prepared party for another election. Not that we particularly want one immediately, but they're in that position. So that's another inhibiting factor that won't be talked about. You'll never hear this, Mr. Singh or anybody talk about it. Now, as far as the Bloc is concerned, they don't have a problem. They do very little fundraising. They spend very little money, and they're only campaigning in Quebec anyway. So they won't get a large rebate because they only have, they only ran in the 78 seats. So as just another thing, a practical thing to keep in mind, no matter what these politicians say and the orchestration and the theatrics, in the end, the small parties do not want either a sheer government or another general election. So they will do whatever it takes to keep Mr. Trudeau's government in office for a while anyway, I think.
Super. We want to give